Mr. President,
The Senator from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I've come to the floor today, once again, to raise objections. In fact, deep concerns about something known as congressionally directed spending. But the more colloquial term for what I'm describing is earmarks. And specifically, I want to talk about the inclusion of earmarks, a lot of them, about $5 billion worth, in this particular package of bills. The government-directed micromanagement of any large, complex economy never works. And by never, I mean literally never. Never in the history of human beings has this worked, has it ended well, except for a small handful who grow richer and more powerful every time government attempts it. Very often, it's undertaken with an eye toward a populist objective, one that's supposed to elevate the poor. But it, in the end, has quite the opposite effect. A reverse Robin Hood world then develops, one in which those who are already wealthy and already powerful become more so, and everyone else suffers. It's been attempted time after time in this country, in other countries, all over the world, in many different eras, and it literally never works. It's like the game Mousetrap. If you ever played Mousetrap as a kid, you know the experience that I'm talking about. In the game of Mousetrap, you'd set up this elaborate system of marbles, and they'd go down a little tunnel and a little ditch, and they would turn a wheel and ring a bell at the end of it. The game never worked. Mousetrap never works. Earmarks never work. Neither does socialism. Neither does the progressive nightmare that we've been living in for a long time, nursing it along, pretending that somehow this time it will turn out differently. It will not. Our former colleague and a dear friend of mine, the late Senator Tom Coburn from Oklahoma, a dedicated fiscal conservative and a fierce, stalwart opponent of earmarks, once said, quote, "Earmarks are the gateway drug to spending addiction." His words were prescient, and they remain as truthful today as ever. Earmarks are by their very nature corrupting of the process, perhaps not in a legally cognizable way, but they are corrupting nonetheless of the process. They allow for special interests to exert greater influence in our politics and steer federal taxpayer dollars to pet projects in individual states or specific congressional districts, often to benefit a particular business enterprise, nonprofit, or someone else. They fund projects that, as worthy or unworthy as they might be, and there's a broad spectrum of earmarked beneficiaries that can be found at every point along a continuum of worthy in the abstract or unworthy, but they've got certain things in common. And one of those is that they often shouldn't be funded by government at all. And for those that ought to be funded by government, many of them shouldn't be funded by this government. This government, which is a government of limited enumerated powers, something that we fail most of the time to even acknowledge anymore, much less respect. Remember, James Madison described at the dawn of our republic, as our Constitution had been proposed but not yet ratified. And during the ratification debates, he penned so many of the Federalist Papers. And in Federalist 45, he wrote that the powers of the federal government are few and defined, and those reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite. The few and defined powers really are that, much as we sometimes like to pretend otherwise. We're in charge of just a few basic responsibilities, where we have exclusive domain within our system of government, where our power trumps state and local power. But those areas really are limited. You see, because our founding fathers understood a very simple truth, which is that the risk of corruption grows larger, and the difficulty of overcoming corruption becomes more distant, more remote, more tenuous, the higher the level of government you go. They understood that problems arising in a government are much more difficult to eradicate in a larger, more national government, and that's why they very carefully, almost religiously, reserved most of the power to be exercised at the state and local level. But they carved out exceptions. What are those exceptions? Well, the most notable and obvious among them are national defense, weights and measures, trademarks, copyrights and patents, postal roads, regulating interstate and foreign trade or commerce, and there are a few others, but that's the gist of it. There is no general power in there. There's no power in there, for example, to say, let's make sure we have good schools. Let's make sure everybody's happy. Let's make sure that a good idea gets funded. No, those things don't exist in there. That's a figment of our imagination. For the first 150 years of our republic, when operating under the Constitution, we respected those limits and those boundaries. It started to change during the New Deal era in the 1930s, where Congress and the executive branch and the judicial branch undertook a sort of collusive pattern of behavior to sideline principles that had fostered the development of the greatest civilization the world had ever known and had ushered in one of the greatest, most prolonged eras of more or less continuous peacetime economic expansion. And they just said, those rules that have worked here in the past that are still the law, were still the law in the 1930s and remain the law today, we're going to set those aside. We're going to make them malleable. We're going to decide that they can mean whatever we want them to mean. But, Mr. President, as Mark Twain is quoted as having said, if you name the tail of a dog a leg, and you ask how many legs does the dog have, what's the answer? Well, it's still 4 legs. The tail of a dog is still a tail. It is not a leg, even if you call it a leg. We've called these things federal powers, many of them since the 1930s, or at least looked the other way, with the Supreme Court also looking the other way since the 1930s, but it doesn't mean that these are appropriate activities for the federal government to engage in. Now, what does this have to do with earmark spending? Everything. Because when we earmark spend, almost every time, not always, but almost every time, is dealing with something that's at the far frontiers of what's even debatably connected to something that is debatably connected to an enumerated federal power. We've steered so far away from where we're supposed to be acting, we've forgotten why we're here. And as is the case when raising kids, especially when they get to be teenagers, you get into trouble when you stop doing the things that you are supposed to be doing. And when you start doing things that you're not supposed to be doing, you forget the things that you are supposed to be doing, and you don't do them very well. We see that today, here, in this bill package, right now, where we're being asked to jettison funding for a department that includes, among other things, the enforcement of our immigration laws and the enforcement of our borders. Something that's been severely compromised in the last few years and that President Trump is working hard to overcome. We're being asked to jettison that portion of the bill and replace it with a 2-week substitute, a 2-week temporary continuing resolution. What does this have to do with earmarks? Everything. Has everything to do with it, because as we're not doing that, we're focusing on a whole bunch of stuff that we have no business doing, no business funding. And the way in which we are funding it is itself corrupting and corrosive of a process. Any process that's designed to maintain fiscal sanity, fiscal responsibility, that's designed to maintain a limited government with limited enumerated powers. We've thrown it all to the wind. The consequences have been disastrous. We're $38.5 trillion in debt. We're adding to that debt at a staggering rate, close to $2 trillion a year, with no end in sight. Now, I can already hear the apologists of earmarks, the earmark brigade, we'll call them, saying, well, earmarks are just a tiny, tiny percentage of overall spending. That's true. They are. The same way that when you look at a locomotive, something that might stretch, I don't know, half mile or a mile, the engine car of the mile-long locomotive is a tiny, tiny piece of the train, but it's what's driving the train. That's what earmarks do. They drive excessive federal spending. They facilitate $2 trillion annual deficits. and they drive us into this awful downward spiral that leads us to a very dark place. Now, at a time like this, when American families around the country are working hard, and the comeback is still just getting started, Congress really does need to remember its role as the steward of tax dollars. And to be a good steward of tax dollars, it's got to recognize some limit around its authority. But it doesn't do that. And earmarks facilitate our further drift away from that standard. We should consider earmark spending in the context of our $38.5 trillion debt that we're adding to it at a rate of nearly $2 trillion a year. And our debt itself is a percentage of the economy, we have to remember, is at an all-time high. It's not just that the nominal debt, that the number is higher than it's ever been. That's true. We've never had a $38.5 trillion debt. But adjusted by every conceivable metric, whether you look at it in inflation-adjusted dollars, whether you look at it as a percentage of the economy, it's at an all-time high. Now, fortunately, President Trump and many Senate Republicans have worked hard in an effort to root out wasteful spending and decrease the likelihood of a debt crisis, of inflation, or both. I remember the excitement when about a year ago, a little over a year ago, as we were preparing for the new administration and the new Senate Republican majority to kick in and the new House of Representatives to continue under Republican control. There was a lot of enthusiasm over it. With President Trump and Elon Musk kickstarting the DOGE process. You saw every Republican in Congress, and really in both chambers, chomping at the bit to be part of the DOGE movement. It was cool, it was hip, it was happening. It was the energy that this town needed. Everybody was excited about it. Everybody wanted to be part of the DOGE process. And then all of a sudden, they lost interest in it within just a few months. It's faded. And that's really, really sad. But you fast forward to now, and there's still a lot of good things that we could and should be doing. In fact, just days ago, President Trump announced his appointment of a new Department of Justice official who will focus specifically on efforts to root out the fraud and abuse of American taxpayer dollars. That's a good thing. It's a natural outgrowth of the DOGE effort. It's a natural outgrowth of President Trump's desire to make America great again. This is an important project, and I hope and expect that it will succeed. Yet, sometimes I think that while we draw near to the concept, to the idea, to the suggestion of being more efficient, being more careful as stewards of the people's hard-earned money, we draw near to these concepts with our lips, but we show through our actions that our hearts are far from it. We've got Democrats who are continuing to push for more spending, more earmarks, and more government. That's not the path to prosperity. As I've said before, earmarks don't just promote reckless spending. They are reckless spending. The process itself, when in the hands of fallible mortal human beings, is itself naturally corrupting. They naturally do lead to and contribute to, but fundamentally are reckless spending. Now, according to the Congressional Research Service, from 1994 to 2011, there was a 282% increase in earmarks in appropriations bills. So, after the very successful red wave election of 2010, the election in which I was first elected to the United States Senate, both the Senate and the House Republican conferences simultaneously adopted earmark bans, correctly recognizing the corrupting nature of earmarks and their growing contribution to an increasingly problematic and unsustainable fiscal picture for the federal government. I remember that moment well. I had just been elected to the Senate. It was November of 2010. I had yet to be sworn in. That wouldn't happen until January of 2011. But I came back here for my new member orientation and was permitted as a newly elected senator-elect to participate in my first Senate Republican conference. And it was in that measure that I supported and advocated aggressively for the earmark ban that we adopted. It was a great move. So successful and so popular, so backed by popular voter demand was this anti-earmark wave that even former President Obama, while occupying the White House at the time, agreed right then. He said, quote, shortly after the November 2010 election, about the same time the Senate Republican Conference, just down the hall from here in the Capitol, adopted this earmark ban, which, mind you, is still in place. He said, quote, I agree with those Republican and Democratic members of Congress who have recently said that in these challenging days, referring to rising deficits and debt levels, that we cannot afford earmarks, close quote. He was absolutely right. And if he was right then, it follows, in fact, it follows a fortiori. It's even more true today that the same words that President Obama uttered then are even more applicable then. If they were applicable then, they are more applicable now, way more applicable. Our national debt is several multiples of what it was then, $38.5 trillion, adding to it at a rate of about $2 trillion a year. Now, in 2019, Senate Republicans made the earmark ban permanent. It had previously been considered temporary, a pause, a moratorium. And we had this decade-long earmark moratorium. During that moratorium, what happened? Did the sky fall? No, it didn't. It didn't fall. Were there dogs and cats living together in the streets? Book of Revelation stuff? Not at all. There was no Armageddon. Were there disastrous political consequences to the Republicans who had spearheaded that earmark ban? No, not at all. Republicans did not suffer massive electoral defeat. In fact, within a few years, we captured the majority again in the United States Senate. So to my Republican colleagues, stop telling yourselves that earmarks are necessary, that they're indispensable, either for electoral success or the survival of the American economy or the survival of your home state's economy. They are not. That simply is not true. That is a lie we tell ourselves. It isn't true. Unfortunately, however, after Democrats took back the White House with House and Senate majorities also under Democratic control in 2021, they brought back the earmark practice. And sadly, many Senate Republicans decided to go along with it at that time. Let's just go along because they're doing it. We might as well not let them have all the fun. So some started to do that. Now, this return in recent years, starting in 2021, to include billions of dollars worth of earmarks in annual spending bills, this is a microcosm of federal waste and Congress's refusal to properly act to stave off a fiscal crisis. This, Mr. President, is the kind of direct attack on the president's economic agenda that goes unnoticed because those who support it often do so quietly, sometimes with a whisper or a whimper. Mr. President, I will not go quietly, nor should I, nor should any of us, when we consider what we do to our children and our grandchildren, whether they're born or unborn, whether their parents are alive yet or not. Our posterity will suffer from the consequences of these. But it's not just that, Mr. President. It's those of us who are alive today, those of us who are working hard just to provide for our families today who suffer, because when we spend too much money, everything costs more money. As Milton Friedman used to say, the true rate of taxation has to be measured not just by the top marginal tax rate, You have to look at the rate of government spending as a percentage of the economy, because one way or another, that piper's got to be paid. One way or another, it comes out in the wash. One way or another, the people will pay for it. They pay for it in terms of higher prices on everything they buy, every good, every service. And tragically, Mr. President, it is not the wealthy who bear this burden disproportionately. It's hardworking Americans, poor and middle-class Americans, those who work hard, pay their bills, pay their taxes, and find that every dollar they earn buys a little bit less. We've seen more of that in the last few years than we have in a very long time. The government agencies, for their part, very often will try to hide the true impact of this, but they can't hide it for too long. They can conceal it, they can obscure it a little bit, but the American people know. They know what's happening. This is catching up to us. Are earmarks the whole problem? No. Are they a small percentage of overall federal spending? Yes, they are. Is discretionary spending much smaller than all mandatory spending? Yes. But this is all part of the same problem. And again, it's earmark spending that drives the train. It's earmark spending that very often distracts us away from the things we're supposed to be doing and takes us down a direction of areas where the federal government probably shouldn't be acting in any event. So let me ask this question. How, Mr. President, are voters to trust Republicans in Congress to get spending in order and reduce our national budget deficits and eventually our debt if we don't have the discipline as a conference to cut even a few $1 billion in pork barrel spending? How can we as Republicans in Congress, in the House or in the Senate, rightfully cancel wasteful foreign aid and subsidies to left-wing public radio, but then simultaneously offset those things by greenlighting the enactment of several $1 billion worth of wasteful earmarks? Now, I'll concede here. Everybody's got a different definition of what's wasteful, what's good, what's bad. I'll concede that a number of these probably go to worthy beneficiaries, or at least good people intending, wanting to do good things for the American people. It doesn't mean that it's our money to spend. It doesn't mean that it's the appropriate role of the federal government to do that. It doesn't mean it's appropriate for any government to do that. And it doesn't mean that this process, the way we do it here, isn't terribly corrupting, with a tendency to drive up overall federal spending. To quote President Trump, for years, quote, "The radical left Democrats exploited the green energy scam as an excuse to funnel many billions of dollars into their own massive slush funds and drastically drove up prices," close quote. That's what happens. That's what they do. Well, through certain earmarks, they quietly do the same, diverting the tax dollars of the American people to the kinds of projects that should never receive taxpayer money. In total, the cost of earmarks this time around is around $5.2 billion. Yes, it's a small percentage of overall federal spending. Yes, it's a small percentage even of the federal spending in this particular package. But it's what's driving the train. And it's emblematic of the kind of problem that creates the much larger problem. While we're focused obsessively on doing these, we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. Speaking of emblematic, as we remove funding for the Department of Homeland Security, one of the few departments that's pretty easy to fit within the enumerated powers of the federal government. Well, why? Well, because the federal government's in charge of immigration laws, borders, the enforcement of those laws, governing immigration and nationality, that sort of thing. And yet that's what gets pulled out. We leave in there all the stuff that's tangentially related, at best, to enumerated federal powers under the Constitution. Now, in total, yeah, it's a small percentage, but it's what's driving the train. Earmarks aside, perhaps the biggest problem with spending bills, with these spending bills, this package of spending bills that we'll soon be considering, is that they simply spend too much money. Much of this stems from the fact that discretionary outlays spiked during COVID, and they never came back down to pre-COVID levels. In fact, total discretionary spending from FY 2020 through FY 2024 was $1 trillion higher than the Congressional Budget Office had projected it to be over that time frame when they issued their 2019 budget baseline projections. That's the discretionary side. Meanwhile, the mandatory side also exploded, so it got a lot worse. A lot of people are fond of saying, well, it's not discretionary spending, it's mandatory spending, but they both went way, way up. It's time to stop talking a big game about fiscal responsibility and to show voters that we measure up to the task. We cannot simply relent when Democrats want to tie the hands of this administration and saddle the American people with unsustainable debt. So the question I pose to my colleagues who are okay with earmarks in their spending bills is this: why are Senate Republicans supporting the effort to ignore our conference's still active, still intact earmark ban to partner with Democrats and reverse course on President Trump? Don't believe me? Well, this bill, as presently constituted, does, among many, many other things, the following. It funds hospitals and healthcare clinics that provide puberty blockers to children and perform abortions. It does that. It sends money to a dance festival. Now, this dance festival may be lovely. I'm not really personally into dance festivals. Maybe some are. Those who like them, I hope they enjoy them. Dance festivals, I'm sure, can be a great thing. Doesn't mean that the federal government should be funding it, or any government. I don't know why it's the job of any government that collects money from people, loosely speaking, at the point of a gun, because if you don't pay your taxes, eventually people with guns will come and issue a fine or haul you off if you refuse to pay. But we're funding it anyway. It provides for $1 million renovations at both the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. Let's think about that for a minute. It's one of the wealthiest cities, not only in America, but in the world. And let's take the opera, for example. The opera, great thing. I love the arts. It's fantastic. This is not exactly an everyman hobby. Now, I'm sure there are exceptions, but this is, it's got a well-earned reputation for being something that's favored by the elite, by very wealthy individuals in one of America's wealthiest cities. So why are we sending them $1 million? Metropolitan Opera, last time I checked, has an endowment with, worth about $255 million. It's got multiple employees earning in excess of $1 million a year. I believe it's got real estate assets valued at around $500 million. And yet, hardworking Americans in Peoria, Illinois, and Orem, Utah, all over the country, people who probably don't visit New York very often, if ever, who may not be into the opera, they're all being asked to subsidize that, to pay $1 million for elevator renovations, not only at the Metropolitan Opera, but also at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Why? Why is that our role? But not only why is it our role, why is it the responsibility of a plumber from Montana who's just trying to feed his family, who's probably never going to attend that opera or the Metropolitan Museum of Art? Why are you sticking that person with the bill? The spending package also allocates dollars for nonprofits, specifically nonprofits providing aid and counseling and legal services to illegal aliens, to individuals whose sole uniting characteristic is that they are here inside the United States unlawfully. Why are we doing that when it's counter to what we're supposed to be doing, which is to discourage illegal immigration and to make possible bringing to justice those who break the laws? Something that, oh yeah, we're removing that part of the bill that would even do that because we're too busy making sure that we're funding the hobbies of the ultra-wealthy in one of America's wealthiest cities that most Americans will never visit. This is reverse Robin Hood at its worst. This, Mr. President, is taking money from the poor and giving it to the rich, and it's wrong. The bill also contains earmarks funding a nonprofit organization called NICE. Now, don't let the name fool you. NICE is not so nice. NICE is the new immigrant community empowerment to assist illegal aliens in getting jobs, jobs that ought to go to American citizens, or at least individuals who, if not citizens, are inside the United States legally and legally authorized to work in the United States of America. Mr. President, the federal government through taxpayers should not be funding hospitals that give puberty blockers to children, or nonprofit museums, or left-wing labor activist organizations, or left-wing physicians activist organizations, or groups providing legal aid or subsidized housing specifically to illegal aliens. It shouldn't do that. Shouldn't do that ever, regardless of who's in charge, especially at a time when the House of Representatives is under Republican control, when the Senate is under Republican control, and the White House is occupied by a Republican president. Shouldn't do it ever, but especially not when Republicans are in charge of all three levers of the two political branches, the legislative and executive. Senate Republicans especially should not be facilitating this abuse of power and of the hard-earned money of the American people, many of whom work months out of every year just to pay their federal taxes, only to find that every dollar they have left buys less because we're spending too much money. Well, we shouldn't be facilitating this abuse of power and violating pledges that President Trump and that we ourselves as Senate Republicans have made on the campaign trail to root out and end wasteful, woke spending across the federal government. Even in a Republican-controlled Congress, Democrats are still able to effectuate and fund a radical agenda that the American people opposed when they elected us to this majority, and that we promised we wouldn't perpetuate. And yet, here we are. It's tragic. Congress, Mr. President, does not need to and should not use earmarks as sweeteners, for lack of a better word, to make the appropriations process work. We cannot continue appropriations bills that perpetuate excess spending, especially when those same things are pushing policies that inevitably, invariably, deliberately hobble the efforts of this administration. This is like putting a humidifier and a dehumidifier in the same room and just letting them fight it out when you promised only the dehumidifier would be there. And at a minimum, we should build on the successful rescissions bill initiated through the DOGE process and carried forward throughout last year on the successful rescissions bill by exerting some basic fiscal discipline to enforce our conference rules and put an end to earmarks. Or rather than just put an end to it, resume the end that we put in place 15 years ago. Heal the breach that's now been there for about 5 years and honor what is still our conference position. Only then will we be able, I believe, to tackle the self-inflicted economic wounds that cloud the bright skies of opportunity before us. Now, as President Trump said in his end-of-year speech just a few weeks ago, quote, "We're poised for an economic boom, the likes of which the world has never seen," close quote. I believe him. And he's doing a lot of things that are helping us get there. The least we can do is not undercut him. And to achieve that potential, we, Congress, we, the Senate, and we, the Senate Republican Conference, in the majority, must act. Earmarks aren't the way. They're the wrong way. Earmarks aren't the solution. They're the problem. We need to end them. In connection with this package of bills, I've put forward an amendment to strip them from this bill, and I humbly, but with all the conviction I'm capable of communicating, implore my colleagues to support the amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.